And my name is Chris Bean. I'm the managing director of the McCormick Institute. So, again, thank you all for being here. Plan is we're going to talk to Reihan for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So be thinking about what you like, what you want to ask, and then we have at least one microphone there, and maybe I'll give up mine. I haven't decided. So anyway, okay. So let me do a more formal introduction here. So I actually ran into Reihan 5-6 years ago at an event in AEI, and I had two thoughts. One, this guy is really, really smart. And two, he's obnoxiously young, and so here we are. And well, neither one of us are here for that. Anyway, but it's a real privilege to have him here at this moment in time. Our objective was to offer some real-time commentary of the campaign as it was going on, and given that Super Tuesday is tomorrow, we couldn't have hit that much better right now. So it's great to have him here. Reihan is executive director of National Review, not the National Review, National Review. He's a policy fellow at the National Review Institute. He's author of an agenda blog for the National Review Online, contributing editor of National Affairs, a CNN political commentator, a columnist for Slate magazine. A column just came out today that I'm sure we'll get to. He's appeared on NPR's Friday Political Roundtable, on Real Time with Bill Maher, and on the Colbert Report. So, guy gets around. I don't know when he sleeps, but that's his story. So anyway, he's also the editor, the co-author of The Grand New Party: How Conservatives Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream. So will you please join me in giving a proper welcome to Reihan Salam.
Thanks very much for having me, Chris.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here. So before we get into all the stuff that we really should be talking about, I just want to ask you, for the students here, can you just give us a little bio in terms of your own political trajectory, your own political biography? Have you always kind of considered yourself conservative, and have you always been interested in politics? Did it come by your family, or what?
So I was really lucky. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and I hadn't really met anyone who was not a fairly straightforward liberal until I was, I want to say, 14, 15. And I took part in a variety of different extracurricular activities, and I also did a fair bit of reading on my own. I was not a very school-oriented person, but I always liked to read, partly because, I read a lot of comic books, and I read a lot of magazines, and they were just around the house, so it was just interesting to me. And I like to argue as well, partly because, my family is a family that perhaps like a lot of yours too, there was a lot of arguing all the time. And I remember meeting a bunch of young people when I was, 15, 16, who were all pretty devout Christians. I didn't grow up in a Christian household, but it was, very interesting and striking. And they had beliefs that were very, very different from mine. Beliefs that I definitely didn't share. But it was interesting because I'd grown up with a lot of stereotypes about people from different backgrounds and what have you, and I was really surprised by how sharp these girls and boys were, and about how they had to be really thoughtful about their beliefs because they were surrounded by people who didn't agree with them. Some of them came to their beliefs because of their own families, others did not, but I just remember finding this enormously stimulating. So, when I was at that age, I thought of myself as a liberal, but those people I was surrounded by definitely introduced a kind of hint of doubt in my thinking. And when I was in college, it was almost as though I had this kind of weird, uncomfortable, borderline horrifying realization, like, oh man, it turns out that I actually don't think the things that I used to think at all. There was just too big a contradiction between a lot of the things I had come to believe through my own reading, writing, and thinking, and people that I'd come to know, and kind of the way that I thought of myself. So that was so that's around the time I thought I came to think of myself as a conservative. Around the time I was your age when I was in college, and then my first job out of college was at the New Republic, which was a liberal magazine at the time, but actually a magazine that had always employed some conservatives. And I wasn't actually planning on working in media, but this was in 2001, which was kind of a baby recession. It was nothing compared to 2008, but it was a little recession that kind of led people to kind of think, gosh, all of these consulting jobs and what have you that we thought were going to be out there just, weren't there. Now, I hadn't really planned ahead that well, but I figured, I love this magazine, let me apply for a job there. I was lucky enough to get one there. And this was the year that 9/11 happened, the 9/11 terror attacks. And, for people of my vintage, that was a very, very big deal. It had a huge effect on how we thought and how we looked at the world. But the other thing that happened is that for a lot of us, what we thought and believed in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq was really challenged by what happened over the next 3 or 4 years. Because, a lot of people of my age cohort, we saw, we were far past the Vietnam era, and we thought the United States can do great things. If you have the right idea, if you have the right belief system, you can make great things happen. And we saw that belief really challenged. So I think of myself as coming from this interesting little generation before the financial crisis hit, but then after 9/11, that had this pretty searing experience. And I find that a lot of people who came of age with me during that time, a lot of us started out thinking one set of things, and we wound up thinking a very different set of things by the time we were at the end of it. So I think that kind of prepared us for a world that's been a lot less predictable than it's been in the recent past.
That's right. Thank you. All right, so let's move to the title, Donald Trump and the Future of the GOP. So January 21st, National Review publishes an issue entirely devoted to making the case for why Donald Trump should not receive the nomination, why it should not be the standard bearer for the Republican Party. And I guess I'm interested to kind of know how you came to that point, how you and the other editors and writers at the magazine decided this is the step we need to take. And I wonder, was there arguments about, is this the right decision, and is this the right time, or do you feel like, what was the debate going on at the magazine in order to come to that point?
Well, National Review has a very special identity. There's no reason you guys would be familiar with this history, but the magazine was founded in 1955 at a time when the conservative movement was pretty marginal compared to where it is today. And it was led by William F. Buckley Jr., and his thinking was, we need to forge a new alliance, and we need to drive a kind of change in the larger political dynamic of the country. And also, there was this belief that the Republican Party could be the vehicle for the conservative movement, despite the fact that, now we think of the two parties as very ideologically defined, but at the time they were coalition parties. You had lots of people with different ideological beliefs in both political parties. You had someone like a Jacob Javits, the senator from New York State, who was very much a liberal, but he was a liberal Republican, rather than a liberal Democrat as he might be today. So, we take very seriously the idea that conservatism, the conservative movement, is something in which our magazine plays a pretty important role, partly because we helped define what conservatism was in that era. And the term that people use, the term that Frank Meyer, one of the early editors of the magazine, used, he was a senior editor, was fusionism. That is, an alliance between people who are of a more libertarian inclination with people who are more traditionalist in their thinking. So you might think that people who are, let's say, Christian conservatives, people who want to remoralize the public square, people who want religious values to be defended in public, that those people wouldn't necessarily be arm in arm with libertarians. But the idea of fusionism was that actually we have some big common enemies. One of them is communism globally. And another one is the threat of a real centralized administrative state that is actually going to take power away from local communities and put it in a federal government that does not share the values of most ordinary people. So the thought was that libertarians and traditionalists should be allied. And I guess, more recently, if you look at the Trump phenomenon, there was just this belief widespread among the editors that this is not someone who represents this belief system, who has not adhered to this belief system for a very long time, who now claims to adhere to this belief system, but it doesn't appear that he takes it all that seriously. That's not to say that there wasn't some dissent and disagreement. And I guess what you could say is that, there was anti-Trump sentiment, and then there was also anti-Trump sentiment. And that's been something very common among a lot of folks on the right. And when you're looking at the anti-Trump sentiment, it's not so much that, gosh, Donald Trump really is everything he says he is, but rather it's that he is speaking to concerns that other Republicans have failed to speak to, and also on an issue or two of particularly great importance. Donald Trump appears to be closer to the right side than many of the other Republicans who are in the race. And that he speaks a certain kind of, so there is that anti-Trump sentiment rather than kind of anti-Trump versus pro-Trump sentiment. But I think that there was also a widespread belief among my colleagues, and this is also true more broadly among a lot of movement conservatives, that Trump was really a media-created phenomenon, and that the phenomenon would not last all that long, that you had this very big and divided field, and as it consolidated, support for Trump would fade away, and that didn't happen. So, for a very long time, for many months, there, certainly were many pretty robust attacks on Trump published. But then the thinking was, on the part of our editor, Rich Lowry, the thinking was that we need to demonstrate by drawing on a breadth of contributors, people who represent lots of different streams of conservative thinking, why this person is not, should not be the GOP nominee. And it was, something that took a lot of doing. And also there was a lot of thinking about how to get the timing exactly right, et cetera. Some of you guys have studied rhetoric, and some of you, so, to some extent you've got to think deeply about, kind of when do you do this? You have to think of it strategically. And also, you have to think a bit about, well, look, there are many voters who gravitated to this person for a reason. And so when you attack the individual, you have to also be careful not to alienate and to attack the people who are drawn to him, because many of those people, could be potential allies. So those were some of the thoughts and sensitivities that went into putting it together.
That's really interesting. Thank you. So, as you said, National Review is the grand dame of American conservatism, very high-minded, very well-respected, long-standing, and you put this out there, and, you could claim that you kind of like set your marker with respect to the Republican establishment, maybe woke them up a little bit, but neither that issue nor much else seems to have had much impact at all on this phenomenon, right? And so I guess I have one little and one big question. The little question is about National Review. It's before me, so it's a long time ago, but the National Review took on the John Birch Society and was pretty darn successful. And now we're looking at something, that's at least has some similarities, and it doesn't seem to have had much of an impact. And I wonder if that says something about the kind of the condition of media right now. Is it say something about print journalism or something like that? So that's one question. And then the bigger question is just what does this say about the even existence of something you could singularly call the Republican establishment or the Republican Party? I mean, can you even talk about that? Because it seems like if there was a singular noun there, that there probably would have been more success in terms of changing the debate or, marginalizing Trump more effectively.
So one way to think about it, think about entrepreneurship. Think about when you are trying to start a business. Now, when you're trying to start a business, let's say I was trying to start a competing university. And my thinking is, Penn State is here in State College, Pennsylvania, a really big school. I'm going to compete with Penn State. So one way to compete with Penn State is I'm going to build a large residential campus with a vast network of libraries, with dormitories, with terrific sports teams. And I'm going to build it about 40, 50 minutes outside of State College, Pennsylvania. And I'm going to compete with them kind of head-to-head, one-to-one. That's actually pretty hard to do because Penn State has been around for a very long time. It has a reputation that's been built up over a very long time, and it also kind of first emerged at a very different kind of time. So it's kind of evolved, and to replicate it very quickly, if I'm a competitor, would be really, really, really hard, and also really, really expensive. So what competitors might do instead is, well, let's look at the students that an institution like Penn State does not serve quite as well. Let me think of non-traditional students. A huge number of college students these days are commuting students. They're oftentimes older students. Let's say they're over the age of 25. They oftentimes work a job. So when you look at actually the new universities that have been created, in many cases they're distance learning institutions, they're online. They exist in a totally different kind of place. So when you think about political competition, it's useful to think about it in a different kind of way. Do you compete symmetrically? Do you try to be the same kind of candidate and do the same kinds of things? Or do you go where the other candidates don't go? And it turns out that if you look at the Republican field, there is this, big issue where, over 60% of Republicans want immigration levels to decrease in the United States, whereas only 7% wanted them to increase. If you look at leading Republican figures in the country, actually a lot of them wanted immigration levels to increase, and substantially. So simply coming and saying, well, I'm going to serve the 60% plus of the party rather than the 7% of the party. Or similarly, one thing a lot of people don't know, there's this new Rand Corporation study which found that 51% of Republican primary voters, self-identified Republicans rather, are friendly to the idea of raising taxes on people earning over $200,000 a year. That's pretty surprising. And actually, when you think about Republican candidates in presidential elections, they don't actually serve that constituency. That's potentially a pretty big constituency. Sometimes you have people like Mike Huckabee say, I'm going to defend Social Security, Medicare. So there are a lot of these things that actually, underserved markets, you might say, in the kind of political marketplace that just haven't really been touched. So when you ask about National Review, one complicating factor is that back when National Review started, there were very few media voices on the right. Media was very tightly controlled because it was expensive to have a printing press. It was expensive to own a kind of radio broadcasting network. Very few people had those assets. And then you had cable that kind of lowered the barrier to entry, became easier to have your own channel of information. And then, certainly with the internet, you have a million channels of information that can access people. And so, what happens then, if you have very few sources of information, the sources of information that you do have, you tend to trust. Because, well, they have information and I don't have access to it. When you have many different sources of information, all of those institutions that used to be the gatekeepers, that used to be able to tell you, well, here's what's right and here's what's wrong, well, you can question them now. Because you have your data and they have their data. Hey, look, you might be telling me this about unemployment, but I have the website Shadow Stats. Or I can go myself to look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or I can listen to any number of people who tell me that those numbers are malarkey. Those numbers are nonsense. And those people before, they didn't have that kind of credibility, whereas now, we can attack the credibility of any institution. If you think about, Penn State, and, if you think about the football program, and if you think about some of the questions, something like that, if you think about the Catholic Church, it's not just political parties, it's any number of institutions that used to have an enormous amount of authority because people trusted them, because people had to trust them. These were the people with access to information. The New York Times used to say, we're all the news that's fit to print. Yeah, because, they were the gatekeeper. So if it appeared in the New York Times, it was a fact. Whereas now, any one of you can figure out, like, actually that article is totally wrong, or that article is egregiously biased. That article about what's happening in Germany, I can actually read, 24 English language sources about Germany saying totally contradictory things. So that dynamic also applies to conservative media too. And what that means is that our job is by nature pretty different. We can't take for granted that our word is writ and that people necessarily believe everything we have to say. We have to fight for it. We have to actually know that we're kind of contending against people who are very sophisticated, who have access to other information, and we've got to prove ourselves. It's kind of like a referendum. It's kind of like friendship. Friendship isn't marriage. It's a kind of commitment that's renewed every time you actually see your friend. You know what I mean? So that's something that, means that the hierarchy, you're the boss and we're the guys who are just the followers, just the listeners, it's really flattened out. And that's also had a big effect in politics more broadly. In a way, I would argue that the United States with the Trump phenomenon is late to the party. Some of you guys who follow, maybe you follow European politics here and there. Maybe you've heard about countries like Greece, where you've got Syriza, this far-left political party that didn't even exist 5 years ago, that suddenly came in and formed the government. In Spain, you had two entirely new political movements that came out of nowhere. All of this stuff started happening after 2008, after the financial crisis. And actually, in Europe, the recession was a lot worse, and youth unemployment was a lot worse. And you had a lot of people who felt like, well, look, when I look at the traditional parties of the center, the traditional conservative and even socialist political parties, they seem bankrupt. They seem totally untrustworthy. Whereas in the United States, you didn't quite have that, because our political parties, because we have a two-party system, they're meant to absorb all of these tendencies on the edge. But then sometimes you get someone who's really outside, and then who actually threatens to take over the party that existed before. Because our system assimilates those movements in different ways than what you see in Europe, where you can just start an entirely new party. If we were a European democracy, maybe Donald Trump would start the Donald Trump Party, and he would run his own candidates, and he would kind of go around the country, and maybe he'd win 20, 25% of the vote. But, in Sweden, for example, about over 20% of voters now back a party called the Sweden Democrats that is pretty much a neo-fascist, has its origins as a neo-fascist political party. So you would have something like that, but instead you have someone who is running within a conventional mainstream political party and trying to remake it in his own image. And you have something like that on the Democratic side too. So that's pretty new in the United States, although we've seen it in some point in the past. We haven't seen it certainly in 30, 40 years.
So I want to get back to the building your own college metaphor. And you actually wrote a piece for Slate where you said, I don't hate Trump, I hate the ones that kind of paved the way for him. And it sounds like there's a failure on the part of the Republican Party to recognize these listened to constituents, and that's what made this possible. And I wonder if you would, and I don't even know if this is, but I'm thinking about it. I wonder if you wouldn't say something very similar about what happened in the Democratic Party as well. I mean, and if there isn't something about this not connecting, not hearing what's going on in your own constituency that is creating this backlash in both parties.
So if you look at the Democratic Party, briefly, it's pretty striking to see that Barack Obama, a very big share of his coalition, about 40% of his voters, were non-white voters. And yet, when you think about non-white voters, particularly African-American voters, these are voters who have voted monolithically for the Democratic Party for a very long time. And so there is this sense among at least some folks that the party doesn't always listen to the distinctive concerns of this minority community, despite the fact that this community is so essential to having Democrats win elections, nationally and otherwise. So, over the past couple of years, we've had a lot of outrage over police abuses, and a lot of African-American individuals from all over the country who start to think, connecting those stories that they hear that happen in Baltimore or Ferguson or elsewhere to their own lives, their own life experience. And then what they say is that, well, I want national political candidates to start speaking to these issues. Now that's despite the fact that when you think about things that are happening with policing, that's generally been thought of, well, that's a local matter. That's something that state governments handle. That's about a local police force. You take up your concerns with the chief of police, not with the kind of people who are running for president of the United States. Well, that's all changed. You suddenly have this constituency that felt, actually, no, we deserve a place at the table. Our concerns should be listened to, who've become more assertive in this kind of way. And they're not the only ones who've become more assertive in this kind of way. Now, when you're looking at both political parties, there's another dynamic too, which is that there are things that voters think, and those things kind of evolve over time. It's not hard and fast. Like any ordinary person, what you think depends on context, depends on the kind of question that someone asks you. There's a lot of kind of movement around these things. But there are certain kind of consistent gut-level preferences that people have. And then there are the things that politicians say, think, and believe, and the things that, kind of are the people they spend most of their time around, say, think, and believe. So one thing you'll find is that more educated voters actually tend to be more ideological than less educated voters a lot of the time. So when you're looking at politicians, the kind of people who get elected to office, oftentimes they have really, really strong ideological beliefs. But then the people who vote for them, maybe they vote for them because, well, my dad was a Democrat and so am I, and I kind of, I don't like the Koch brothers and kind of whatever else. I don't think about it that much, but that's kind of like basically my belief system. And these Democrats, maybe they're not that great, but they're better than Republicans. That's kind of how a lot of people think about this stuff. And so what happens often is that you have this big gap between what the politicians think and what the people who vote for them think. And what politicians will do is they will engage in crafted language. They try to make it sound like they're completely aligned with their constituents, but they're not always completely aligned. And in the past, that was a lot easier to get away with. Because in the past, you had backroom deals, and you didn't have everything being recorded at all times. And you didn't have people who were really making a strong effort to ensure that people were doing exactly what they said they were, exactly what they promised they were going to do. And because of that, you kind of frankly had a lot more room for compromise. You could grease the wheels. You could say, okay, I know you don't want to do this, but I'll give you something in your district. And I'll send some money to your town. You know, we'll build the space shuttle, you know, or like one wing of the space shuttle in your town, something like that. So then you'll shut up and you'll vote for this bigger bill. Well, you know, one thing that happened is, partly because of these changes in communication, this distrust, this desire for reform, what we started to do is say that, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to have earmarks. We're not going to have these side bribes, these side deals that allow you to make these larger deals. So then you have politicians who are trying to be a lot more consistent, but even then, they're trying to be ideologically consistent in ways that don't necessarily reflect their constituents. So you get a bigger and bigger disconnect over time. And also, by the way, those politicians, they live in an echo chamber, where the things that they think and believe are the things that everyone they know thinks and believes, right? So you get further and further away from what actual people think, your actual voters think, and then suddenly that's that opportunity for someone to come along and be like, well, wait a second, these guys are all charlatans and frauds. You know, I know what you think and I know what you believe, at least on this one issue or this, you know, one or two issues, and I'm going to connect with that directly. And I'm going to make nonsense, make a mockery of everybody else. Now, not everyone can pull that off. You've got to be, you know, someone who has a big reputation, or you've got to be someone with real consistency and credibility, or some kind of charisma, some kind of, you know, something that really allows you to connect directly with ordinary people above all of those institutions, those organs of elite opinion.
So people, pundits and academics certainly, and everybody else is going to be arguing for decades over what kind of accounts for this phenomenon, what made this happen. But I guess I would want to know from you, is this mostly about being late to the party, as you say, you know, the party's not responding to what was actually going on, or is there something, or maybe it's both, is there a kind of political realignment that's actually being that's emerging here, that we're only now becoming aware of, and that actually is going to set the table for politics for the foreseeable future?
One thing that's really funny and important to keep in mind is that what we think of as conservatism and liberalism in the United States, it's not actually what it looks like in other countries. So, for example, in South Korea, it's interesting. The kind of right-wing party is the party that is the party for a more kind of aggressive posture towards North Korea, and is friendlier to the alliance with the United States, and it also tends to be the party of older people. And the left-wing party isn't actually all that left-wing as we would think of it. I mean, both parties want to expand the welfare state, you know, they're pretty comfortable with that idea. But the left-wing party wants a more conciliatory, those are obviously not issues that are the biggest issues in the United States. You know, it really varies from country to country, and one way to think about this is that you have people, you have thinkers, you know, at some point, who are, you know, the political scientist Hans Noel calls them coalition merchants. They have a set of ideas that they say, actually, this idea fits together with this idea. It's kind of like, you know, chocolate chip cookies fit really well together with milk. So we're going to kind of combine those two things together, and that's going to be our package deal, and that's going to be our coalition. The coalition is uniting a lot of different interest groups, okay? So if you look at the United States and the kind of conservative movement as it first came of age, it's kind of interesting because there are a lot of different coalitions available to you. And one idea was, well, you know, some of these Southerners who are, you know, have traditionally been Democrats, and there's lots of conflict about this, but, you know, one view is that, well, it's the kind of migrants from the North, the Yankees who moved to the South, we want those guys, and we also want the kind of rising middle class as this region industrializes and catches up with the rest of the country. And we want to connect those guys with the people who used to be, you know, for these kind of very conservative isolationist senators, like Robert Taft of Ohio. We want to build this kind of new amalgam of these two different forces. That's different from what the Republican Party had been before, which is a coalition of liberals, moderates, and conservatives. But this coalition is going to allow us to win elections. And you needed someone like Buckley, someone who was kind of introducing these ideas. Then you needed politicians who were like, okay, I'm actually going to put this coalition together. But if you look at, you know, on the left, you've got this guy that probably a lot of you guys haven't heard of, Herbert Crowley, who wrote a book in the 1900s called The Promise of American Life. And his idea was that, you know, the liberals, they should be the party of the big cities. And they should be the party of industrial workers. They should be uniting intellectuals and industrial. That's kind of a weird coalition at the time. But in a funny way, that didn't turn out, you know, to be the Democratic coalition, you know, until I'd say the late 60s and 70s. But he saw that coming 50, 60 years before. So it could be that now you have people who are offering different theories of what the coalition ought to look like. So one theory, for example, is it's a fool's errand for Republicans to try to win non-white voters. What you really need to do is get a bigger share of the white vote over time. And so that means that actually some kind of racial polarization could actually be good. You know, this kind of conventional view that it will be bad for you politically is not necessarily right. That's one theory of what a coalition could look like. Another theory is that, well, actually the Republican Party seems to be a kind of middle-class party. If you look at Democrats, they represent poor people, and they represent more educated, more affluent people too, depending on where you are in the country. So in a way, and also if you look at Democratic members of Congress, they tend to represent areas with high levels of inequality, whereas Republicans tend to represent areas that are a little more egalitarian. So, you know, now the party gets a lot of votes from the white middle class. Maybe it can also win votes from the black middle class and from, you know, Hispanic Americans who were born in the United States and some other groups like that. And that's how it's going to grow the coalition. These are two very different theories. You know, they might have some overlap here and there in terms of policies, but they're very different theories of what that future coalition is going to look like. And I've oversimplified things, but that's one way to think about it. And right now we're at a moment where you've got different candidates who are offering very different theories of what the future of the party ought to look like. And those different theories involve very different emphases. They potentially involve very different policies. And, you know, in a way, this debate has been happening over a long time, but it hasn't really come to the surface. Because the people in charge, the kind of people who play the most dominant role in setting the party's direction, I would argue that they engaged in a lot of wishful thinking. So after Mitt Romney was defeated, you had the Republican National Committee put out a report which claimed that the reason Mitt Romney lost was because he wasn't in favor of immigration reform, and he did not have the right views on issues like same-sex marriage and abortion, what they view to be more kind of progressive views. So their theory was the Republican Party needs to win socially liberal, college-educated, upper-middle-class voters and some minority voters. Another theory is that that was crazy, because when you look at Latinos, they are not the same as, you know, kind of, well, some of them, but, you know, it's a very diverse population. They're not the exact same as college-educated, socially liberal people who live in the suburbs of big cities. And actually, in many cases, you know, Latinos are more likely to be lower middle class or working class. And after 2008, it was Latinos who experienced the biggest hit to their household wealth, because Latinos were concentrated in areas where the housing bust had the biggest, most damaging effect. So another theory is that, well, for some of these guys, immigration might matter, but if you had a Republican who said, actually, the fact that you had this devastating housing bust was a problem, and we should have said something about it, and we should have tried to do something about it. Because these are people who tried to own homes, these were kind of aspirational people, these are people who had a lot of the same ideals as conservatives, and they had this terrible, searing experience, and many of them saw their economic dreams completely wiped out. So let's speak to them, but again, you know, you had donors who said, no. Let's just have this different position on immigration reform, which, by the way, a lot of those guys already had. That's pretty convenient, right? So the beliefs that I already have, this election defeat vindicates the beliefs that I already had. It proves that I was right all along. That's what everyone wants to think, rather than, oh man, we really should have tried speaking to these people who kind of who experienced this economic devastation. That latter thing would be much harder, because that would mean, well, I guess I've got to rethink a lot of things then. I've got to rethink a lot of the policies that we've been advancing for a long time. But no one wants to do that. And so you instead get this other few years where people just found themselves caught in a loop.
So of these theories you just delineated, which one do you support? Which one do you think is correct?
So one thing that's always tricky is that people, you know, on the one hand, you know, I think of myself as an analyst, and on the other hand, I think of myself as an advocate. And that's a really hard thing, and that's something that opinion journalists do a lot. There are some journalists who think of themselves as, I'm just telling the facts, I'm just trying to get to the bottom of the story. Frankly, I think that's not always people being honest with themselves. You know, kind of, we all come from families, we all come from communities and towns, we have some idea about who we are and who we care about, and whose stories we want to tell. And also, who we trust, and sort of, you know, who we trust less, right? So that's always going to kind of shape our thinking. And when we get new information, we always see it through that lens. You know. So for me, I think it's really, really important, something I really strive to do that's very hard, is to try to discipline my advocacy thinking and my wishful thinking with, you know, what's actually staring me in the face, what's real. And that's kind of hard to do, because what you guys are really lucky, because a lot of you guys are young, you're students, And so you haven't entered the phase of life where, you know, you've committed yourself. You've said X, Y, and Z, and you've got to stick with that, right? Or people have a certain theory of who you are. And for me, you know, I do have certain bedrock beliefs that have been pretty consistent. You know, a lot of things that I'm saying to you guys right now in 2016 were things I was saying in 2004, 2005. That's not necessarily a good thing, by the way. That could be that I just, you know, kind of have to be true to kind of what I was saying back then. But what I will say is that I believe that working and lower middle class people in this country, their voices are not heard adequately. And that, you know, you have people on the left who want to speak to their concerns, and who have a lot of, you know, great ideas for how to go about doing that. And I just tend not to share their theory of how the world works and how things fit together and how you actually help people have a better life. So I guess my gut instincts are more on the conservative side in terms of what are the kind of institutions we need to allow for a flourishing society. On the other hand, my instincts are also relate to the people that I think about as like, you know, who are we fighting for when we're fighting for political change? Who are the people who kind of matter most? So, you know, one big difference is that there are a lot of people who are a lot smarter than me, and frankly a lot more compassionate and humane and have a lot of other great qualities, who really believe that it is foolish, actually not foolish, it is deeply immoral to care much more about people living in the United States than to care about people living around the world. That's not my belief, because I believe in you know, the principle of subsidiarity. I believe that, you know, one certainly has some regard for people around the world, but that just as you care more about your immediate family, you care more about the people who are part of a collective project with you. And I think of the United States as a kind of unfolding collective project. You know, we have an inheritance. We've inherited really good things. We've inherited, you know, this extraordinary wealth from these institutions. But we've also inherited some obligations that flow from some of the tragedies of our history. The fact that we have a history of enslavement and segregation and much else. You know, those are obligations. You can try to disown them. You're like, I have nothing to do with that. But the thing is that, well, wait a second. You benefit from the good sides. So you've got to at least think about some of the downsides too. That's what I believe. And so I believe that, you know, a very poor American is a hell of a lot better off than a very poor person in Burkina Faso or China. And so that's why a lot of people think, well, you know, it is really egregiously unjust and morally wrong, if not morally indecent, to believe that we ought to think more about that person who's relatively poor by American standards. I don't believe that. You know, I don't believe that we should do things that are going to damage the lives of people in other countries, but I do believe that having greater regard, so that's kind of one gut instinct that I have that contradicts, you know, what other people think. And then there's a lot of other things that relate to, you know, how do you think societies change over time? What's your mental model? Is your mental model that so think about it this way. There are a lot of conservatives, myself included, who think that two-parent stable families are really important for helping people get a good start in life. But when you look at the politicians who talk about those families, a lot of the time those politicians, their life experience is very different from the experience of single parents. Or at least it looks that way. So if I'm someone who's growing up in a kind of poor community with a lot of single parents who are struggling to get by, and I hear a politician talking about how great, you know, two-parent families are, I might feel like that person is judging me. And that person doesn't understand what I went through in my life, doesn't understand the struggles that I've had in my life. So, you know, in a way, sometimes that message that might come from a perfectly good place, the messenger actually matters a lot. And the three things you say before you say that, by the way, two-parent families are really important, matter a lot too. I've noticed this very striking pattern. So my family is Asian American. I come from an Asian American background. And I noticed a really interesting little finding from the General Social Survey, which is that Asian Americans vote really according to their religious affiliation. So it turns out that Asian American Christians, evangelicals, Catholics, etc., they vote a lot like their white counterparts, but they're a bit more democratic. But if you look at Asian Americans who are Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus, they vote a lot like Jewish Americans, overwhelmingly democratic. So you've got to wonder, you know, why is that? And part of it, I wonder, is just the sense that, well, wait a second, you know, we're outsiders. And so when you have this one party that is the kind of white Christian party, well, that party doesn't include us. You know, that's another, like a lot of these things aren't so much about just policies and which policies make sense. A lot of it's about how parties and about how people who are communicating, how they make you feel. You know, do they feel like they're connected to your life? Do they feel like they're on your side? And that was a really interesting thing because, you know, if you look at 2012 and 2008, there was this kind of polling question in the exit polls about, you know, do you think this candidate understands people like you? And you know, the people for whom that was important, they voted overwhelmingly for Barack Obama both times. Because for whatever reason, they didn't feel like John McCain and Mitt Romney really connected with their own life experience. That might seem like a silly thing, like, you know, who cares about that? And there certainly were some voters who said, you know, Mitt Romney doesn't understand people like me, but I'm going to vote for him anyway. And that's really important to me, but I'm going to vote for him anyway, which is kind of cool. But, you know, there's something kind of noble about that. But for a lot of other people, it was just, he just doesn't understand my life experience, so of course I'm not going to vote for him. And that is this piece of politics that's not about what I'm going to do to the Social Security retirement age, or kind of this or that larger argument. It's more visceral. And that's a thing that a lot of politicians don't quite get.
So I want to open it up for questions. But I just want to ask you, you know, one more thing. And, you know, this is an advocate question, not an analyst question, so you let it do with it what you will. But let's just say, you know, this time tomorrow, it's pretty clear that Donald Trump has done very well, and the path for him securing the nomination is going to be very difficult to undo. Let's just say he gets the nomination. What would you advise the Republican Party to do moving forward, both short-term and long-term?
So let's zoom it out beyond Wednesday to, let's say it's, you know, several months from now and Donald Trump has sewn up the nomination, because I do not believe that the outcome of this race is going to be important. It's going to kind of narrow options, but I don't think it's over. So if Donald Trump were to win the nomination, I believe that the party, I believe that Trump would lose in a general election. And I believe that other Republican candidates would have to regroup and think about the future. So to kind of get to that point, I believe that the Republican Party should be a more populist party. Now that's a term that means different things to different people. But basically what I believe is that the party should really rigorously redefine itself around the economic interests of middle-class people. You know, if you just go to surveys, you know, voters, including Republican voters, do not believe that the Republican Party stands up for the middle class. And that's pretty incredible to have people who vote for you, who are middle class, who don't believe that the party actually stands up for their economic interests, but you do. And that's a problem. And, you know, that's going to mean different things to different people. I have a certain sense of what that means, what that would look like. But part of it is, you know, on an issue like taxes, Bill Clinton did something really, really brilliant in the early 90s. You know, Republicans have been defeating Democrats on taxes for a generation. And one of the big reasons, you know, they did so is that through the late 70s, you had bracket creep. It's more complicated, we can talk about that during Q&A. But basically, a lot of middle-class people were paying a very heavy federal tax burden. But then what happened is that after Reagan, and then actually after Bill Clinton, and then again after George W. Bush, you had changes to the tax code, different changes from different ideological direction, but changes that actually made the tax code a lot more progressive. So for middle-income people, their tax burden, their federal tax burden was a lot less important. Well, state taxes are still an issue, everything else, but even if you factor in payroll taxes, their federal tax burden was a much smaller part of their total budget than it had been in earlier eras. So for those middle-class families, what mattered a lot more to them is, do I have access to good health insurance? Do I have access to a decent school? You know, or might I lose my health insurance? What happens if I lose my job? You know, a lot of these other questions actually became a lot more important than your federal tax burden. And Republicans did not have much to say to voters about those issues that they were worried about. You know, will I be able to afford to send my kid to college in the future? You know, these were questions that were a lot more on the minds of people than their federal tax burden. The percentage of people who consider federal taxes the kind of a priority issue facing the country, it's 1%. Wow. So if you have a domestic policy agenda that's really built around the central importance of taxes, you know what I mean? And not that many people find it all that important. So what Bill Clinton did is he said, I'm not going to raise any middle-class person's taxes. I'm only going to raise taxes on people earning $250,000 or more, which today, at inflation-adjusted terms, that's about $450,000. So only these guys who are very well off, very comfortable, but everybody else, you will never see a tax increase. So that was enough for a lot of people. Were like, okay, fair enough, that sounds good to me. If you're telling me that you're going to save Medicare and everything else, which by the way is not mathematically realistic, but regardless, you know, we're going to let all these, we're going to create new spending programs just by raising taxes on the small number of people who earn more than, you know, what would today be $450,000 a year. That sounds like a great deal to me. Sounds brilliant. So in terms of restoring trust, what if you had Republicans say that, okay, we're going to cut middle-class taxes, but we're not going to touch taxes on people earning more than $250,000 a year. We will do it when we have budget surpluses again, when we have robust growth again, then we might be able to revisit that. But for now, that's not our priority. You know, is that going to be a huge vote winner? Maybe, maybe not. But kind of interesting because it actually flips things on their head in terms of trust and in terms of who is going to defend the interests of middle-class people. And by the way, that would be something that would literally, people's brains would explode. I mean, I find it kind of very, I think that would be a huge problem for a lot of people, particularly a lot of donors. It would sound like class warfare, that's what they would say, et cetera. That's just the tip of the iceberg, but that's one way to think about it.
All right. Well, let me ask for that you join me in thanking Reihan, and then we'll open it up for questions.
And by the way, I really encourage you, just, kind of let's talk about practical politics, let's talk about particular controversies, anything you want to get into, I'm happy to.
Question, just come up to the mic there.
I think I heard in the presentation what different groups of Americans are looking for in a politician, and politicians trying to figure out how to appeal to different groups of citizens in order to get elected. And it seems to me that certainly since Clinton, our politicians talking to us and what they say they're going to do is not accurate at all. They aren't doing those things. It's money. It's campaign contributions. It is giving the wealthy a big deal and the rest of us not a very big deal. NAFTA was the beginning of it, destroyed a lot of families, created the immigration problem from Mexico by destroying a lot of the Mexican economy. And to this day, the rich are getting richer ever since then. And that's not an accident. And the average worker is losing ground over and over again. And that's not an accident. The elites are in charge.
You said a bunch of things that I don't necessarily agree with. Yeah. So I want to be sure that I kind of have some clarity on exactly what you're going to say so that I can engage with what you're saying.
I'm almost done. I just want to go back to the founders to show how this system is exactly what they envisioned in a way. Madison, who wrote the Constitution, said, we have to devise a system to protect the elites. I think he called them the opulent minority from the masses. And the deal was, he said, he called us, by the way, Madison, the bewildered herd or the grazing multitude, or both of those, but certainly one of those. And you didn't have a right to vote unless you were wealthy enough to own a lot of property. And he said, we're not going to have a democracy. Your documents don't call this a democracy, it's a republic. And the idea was the wealthy would control the country. They said, in the interest of the people. How's that working for you?
So I'm not sure. Okay, got it. So there are a number of different things you said. Not quite all of which I disagree with, but most of which I disagree with. So just to start out, when we talk about campaign finance, for example, so if you look at an earlier era, the era when, for example, organized labor was at its strongest in the United States, if you look at an era when you had far more equality in the United States, this is also an era when you had a much more laissez-faire system of campaign finance. That is, wealthy people were able to bankroll campaigns much, much more easily than is the case today. If you look at Gene McCarthy, for example, who challenged LBJ so long ago, he was backed by a little coterie of 5 or 6 millionaires who kind of funded his campaign. It all happened very, very fast. And then Gene McCarthy didn't win that election, but he certainly punched LBJ in the jaw. Now, what happened is that after Watergate, you had a system of campaign finance regulation that was designed to make the system fair and more responsive and more small d democratic. There are a lot of complicated things that happened, one of which is that the Supreme Court said you actually can't prevent people from spending money on their own campaigns. Another complicating factor is that we have the First Amendment, which means that if I'm a newspaper, I'm allowed to print any opinion I'd like. And that could mean opinions that are in favor of one candidate or another, or whatever else. Regulating that would really get into this thicket of dealing with free speech. But the long and short of it is, these regulations, what they did is they made political parties much weaker than they had been before. So basically, if you're an individual, you have to have your network of donors, rather than if I'm an individual who doesn't really have any support from wealthy people, well, the party can back me up. They can come in, and so what that means is that you actually have more competitive elections, because actually you can find just the best candidate who doesn't necessarily have the ability, the wherewithal, the kind of their own fundraising network. So that's one of the ironies, of the ways that we try to fix the system actually in some ways, depending on your perspective, made the system worse. If you think that it's actually a good thing that people who don't have a lot of money can't really run for office now, then the system worked perfectly. It worked actually extremely well. But if you think the point of campaign finance regulation was to make the system actually more competitive and more inclusive, then it actually had pretty much the opposite of those effects. Now, if you're looking at Mexico, you know, that's a sort of topic for another time, but it's pretty darn interesting. Mexico is a country where actually the surge in migration began long before NAFTA. It really accelerated from the 70s on. And a lot of that had to do with complicated things that were going on inside of Mexico. It's kind of interesting because if you look at different Mexican states, they have relationships with different US cities and metro areas. And so actually even the level of rainfall had an effect. You had other kind of complicated dynamics, but you also have this other dynamic where Mexico is a highly unequal country. And there's an interesting pattern, which is that when you look at equal countries, countries with an equal distribution of income, they send immigrants to the United States who have high skills. Why is that? Because if I'm coming from an egalitarian country, I feel like, well, if I'm a skilled person, I can't get really rich. I can't, I feel constrained. Maybe the taxes are really high or something like that. So if I go to the United States, I can become much better off. Whereas from unequal countries, the people who come to the United States tend to come from the kind of the poorer sections of the population, sometimes into the middle class. And that's what happened in Mexico. In Mexico, you have a highly unequal country. Mexico is one of the countries in the OECD, the Club of Rich Countries, that spends the least. It has the lowest tax share of GDP. So because of that, partly because of that, Mexico does not spend a lot of money on education. They do not spend a lot of money particularly on people who are Amerindian, people who are the descendants of the indigenous population, the kind of American Indians of Mexico, who are very heavily in places like Chiapas and Oaxaca and other regions like that. So you have this chronic underinvestment, which I would argue is connected to racial prejudice in many cases. And you didn't really have this desire to kind of do much and invest much. You never really had a kind of FDR who was like, I'm going to build a TVA in southern Mexico, okay? So then what you had is a kind of implicit policy of, well, we will turn a blind eye and look the other way while you have massive migration of this kind of impoverished population that in many cases, was very kind of poorly educated by Mexico because there's an opportunity cost issue. So that was something that, again, long predated NAFTA, and NAFTA has had, kind of a mixed effect on the Mexican economy, which we can discuss at greater length. But certainly, trade, global economic integration, these forces have had a very uneven effect on the United States. But it's, I would say that it's a bit more complicated than what we just heard. But, again, these are all topics that we can discuss, ad infinitum. Now, as to the framers, I guess I would say that there definitely was a desire to ensure that when you have political change, that there's a broad and durable consensus around it. So, in a parliamentary democracy, you just have a majority in parliament, and then you just pass a law, and then you just kind of make it happen. Whereas we have all of these elaborate checks and balances, and one way to think about that, well, that's just to protect the ruling class. Another way to think about that is that it was designed to prevent us from actually having this kind of herky-jerky change, like immediate sharp change that is actually not embraced by a sufficiently broad majority of the population. So when you have a large majority in the Senate, which is elected on staggered terms every couple of years, and the House, and you have a president who's kind of aligned with something, that suggests that you have a very deep consensus. But in fact, because our politics are so much more polarized, this kind of majority faction, that's really what Madison warned against. He did not want a majority faction that would attack any given minority. He actually wanted kind of shifting coalitions. So there's a way in which our highly ideological parties are actually what goes against the framers' vision. But that's a lot to talk about. And happy to get into it further, but also happy to answer questions about contemporary politics.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk some about the anti-establishment rhetoric that's very important in the Republican Party the last few years. It seems like there's a potential connection between that and the rise of Trump, the fact that Cruz and Rubio both don't have very much experience at the national level, that they're all our front runners.
And Carson, too.
Yeah, Carson, that the Republican Party has, at least since the Tea Party, if not further, creates such fear of the government, the federal government especially, and people involved in it, that you can't have leaders that have a lot of experience. I was wondering if you think that's connected to this, and if that's going to be a long-term effect, what that might lead to.
This is a very deep issue you've raised, because I would say that there is, and chatted with some of the students earlier today about this. I would say that there is a big asymmetry between the two political parties. There's political scientist Matt Grossman who's written a lot about this, and I recommend you all kind of look into this. But basically what he talks about is that you could think of Democrats as a kind of coalition of different groups that want the government to do certain things. So it could be, I want the government to establish universal health care, or it could be that I want the government to ensure that, abortion is permitted, or kind of any number of other things. And I can have all kinds of different beliefs, but I basically want the government to do certain things. And so I want the government to do those things, and if I only achieve some of my goal, that's okay, because it's actually moving me in that direction. So maybe I'm not going to be able to achieve single-payer healthcare in one fell swoop, and maybe I can't do that because my party is a coalition. It's a coalition of people who are pretty liberal, but also some people who are more moderate and a little more frightened and concerned about stuff like that, and they kind of, so they don't want to do that. So, in a way, the ideological liberals, they've got to talk the moderates and the kind of, other folks who don't always agree with them on everything, and going along with them. So number one, that means they get a lot more practice in the art of persuading people who don't agree with them on everything to get their way. And another thing is that, again, they sometimes think a little bit more long-term about how, okay, we're not always going to get everything we want, but that's fine. Whereas among Republicans, and Republicans, there are moderate conservative voters, to be sure. And also to win an election, win a presidential election, you've got to win some of those moderates. But the Republican Party is a lot more conservative in terms of its voting base than the Democratic Party is, kind of one ideological faction. And because of that, if you're identifying as conservative, you're pretty much always going to win these intra-party fights. And so you kind of get used to using this language of who is a true conservative, who is not a true conservative. And also, because it's really driven by principle, the idea is that half a loaf is not better than none. Kind of like you kind of lived up to principle, and even if you lost on this or that issue, that's okay because you demonstrated that you really, really believe X or Y to be true. Okay? So, when you're talking about this kind of anti-establishment language, it actually goes way, way back into the DNA of the conservative movement that's had such a big role among the Republicans. And, in a way, the Republicans who do well politically, are those who, in many cases, who have such solid conservative credentials that people trust them when they depart from orthodoxy or this or that issue. Because you can say, okay, look, I'm doing what I have to, but you know where I stand. You can trust me. You know what I really believe. And that means that when I try to kind of use this different language or whatever else, when I try to pursue this different policy, you know that I'm coming from a place that is 100% completely aligned with you.
Can you give an example of who you have in mind?
Oh, Ronald Reagan was an interesting example because Ronald Reagan was someone who benefited from the fact that his political opponents thought he was a crazy lunatic. But because of that, actually a funny thing happened in California when he ran for governor. He was someone who was very much the candidate of the right of the party, but he actually wound up making a lot of friends with people on the moderate wing of the party. And when he formed his own presidential administration, it was a different time, but he had a lot of moderates, people who had previously opposed him, who were part of this coalition, who were part of this team. And he was also someone who, demonstrated a fair bit of pragmatism and flexibility, and someone who did things that I don't necessarily agree with, but actually were politically shrewd. For example, Ronald Reagan was a firm believer in free trade, but he also, negotiated with the Japanese to say, we're gonna put on voluntary export restraints. And what he kind of was explaining to them, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, is that if you don't put in place these voluntary restraints, support for free trade in the United States is going to really collapse. So we need to kind of, think about this and be strategic and kind of, you can't just kind of like let this industry be devastated over such a fast timetable. We know what we want to get to, we want real competition, but you kind of have to be thoughtful about that. And when he fought for tax reform in the mid-'80s, which wound up with the 86 tax reform legislation, he really was running about how wealthy people were getting away with all kinds of tax loopholes and that they need to be closed. So he really was making this kind of, class-based appeal. But the thing is, he could do that because people didn't think that he was a communist. They didn't think he was a squish. They didn't think he was a moderate. They knew where he stood, and they knew where he'd been for decades. So that's something that is very, very tricky now for lots of reasons, and one of which is kind of sociological. If you look at the kind of elites of either political party, they are increasingly drawn from social worlds that are very far removed from the people who vote for the party. And so that immediately creates some level of distrust. It also creates the sense of, these people are part of one conversation where they think that, oh, this or that thing is obviously correct. When in fact, it's not tested through experience. I often think about it this way. Between 1990 and 2005, the US dollar appreciated in real terms by about 50%. Now that's the thing that if I own real estate, it's not that big a deal. If I'm someone who travels abroad all the time, that's awesome, because the dollar is stronger, I can spend more money in other countries. If I own a multinational company that's headquartered in the United States, that's great because I get to acquire assets in other countries. It's an amazing thing. But if I am in a goods-producing industry, if I'm an exporter, it's devastating. So, people can talk about tariffs or NAFTA or whatever else, but merely the fact that the US dollar got so much stronger over this period of time was itself a huge, huge deal. But the thing is that if I'm not from Michigan, if I'm not from Indiana, if I'm not from, central Pennsylvania where you used to have a lot of industry that was exporting, and you have some now, but a lot less than you used to, that matters to you, that connects with you. And a lot of the people for whom that mattered, that connected with them, they weren't always super sophisticated about, what is the right policy lever. A lot of them saying, well, we need tariffs or kind of whatever else. But the thing is that people who were sophisticated, the people who were the kind of in the academic economics departments, the people who were the top advisors, they didn't know and didn't really care because they thought, oh, it's all going to work itself out. It turns out now we have the data. There's an economist at MIT, David Otter, who's done this amazing work on what's happened in the regions that were hardest hit by Chinese import competition. And by the way, I do support free trade. But these are regions where, all kinds of chaos has happened in these families. You have people, you have more child abuse, you have more drug abuse, you have all kinds of other things that change. Now that doesn't mean that we have to shut down trade and put up tariffs, but it just means that, God, someone should have cared. Someone should have actually, it would have been nice if there were people from these communities who actually thought about this and actually gave it some thought. And there were a handful of people here and there, but there wasn't enough of it. And so that disconnect between the voting base and the elites of these parties is something that the elites of the parties are paying for right now in a very big way. So, that's kind of, when you talk about this anti-government stuff, et cetera, I guess, I see what you mean, but I kind of feel like when I think about the anger at the establishment, it's this sense that no one is listening. And it's a sense that people are hurting. It doesn't necessarily mean that people are impoverished or whatever else, but it means that they've seen the world that they knew fall apart, and they're angry, and they should be angry.
Come on.
Hello. Okay, I guess my question goes more on what's happening lately with the whole political situation here. Basically, Donald Trump is really good at making shows, really good at keeping the emotions of the crowd together. And I've seen this in my home country with my leader who passed away, Hugo Chavez. I wasn't a supporter of him, but I've seen this type of leader before in the past who just know how to appeal to the emotion of the people. And you only see them rise and rise in the polls. And it's what we're looking with Trump now. So what would you say the strategy of the other candidates, both Republicans and Democrats, eventually if Donald Trump wins, should be in order to fight this? Because I've seen many times before, especially in my country, how a traditional political leader is not able to defeat the political clown that knows how to get the show. Especially with the media today, that just loves that and sells that to the public. So,
What's your name?
I'm Abraham.
Abraham. Thank you very much for that, Abraham. So you're not the first person to have noticed this parallel, and it is really interesting. I guess I always am interested in the kind of comparative context, because the United States, we often think of ourselves as completely different, unique, and distinct, and we are very unique in a lot of ways. But also, it really is true that if you look at other Latin American democracies, in many cases they have constitutions that are pretty similar to ours, but they've had trajectories that have wound up being very, very different. And also, partly, for all kinds of complicated reasons, we're a much more unequal society than we have been, et cetera. If you look at Latin America, you have a lot of societies that have had this inequality. You also have societies that have much more complicated patterns of racial identity than we do in the United States. So one thing about Chavez is that my understanding, tell me if I'm wrong, is that there's this Carioca community. There's a kind of mixed race population that's kind of a very big part of Venezuela. And the sense was that Chavez was someone who represented this population and really kind of spoke to them. Whereas a lot of Venezuela's elites have tended to be Creole, kind of European descent, okay? So, that's another really interesting dimension to this kind of thing, and I think we're going to see more of this rather than less in the American future. I have my pet theory about how to think about this, which, again, I'm not an expert on this kind of thing, but what I believe is that what Donald Trump has done is disorient his opponents. Because basically, there are all of these things he's done, all of these things that people said were outrageous and unacceptable. So, for example, when he insulted John McCain's war service, or any number of things, when he insulted a man who was severely disabled, when he did any number of these things, when he kind of said really, hateful things about women, in some cases, the expectation was that, well, if any ordinary politician did such a thing, they would unravel and kind of, but it didn't happen with him, because basically, he's always been he's always been going in this direction, and people expect him to go in this direction. People expect him to apologize, and he doesn't apologize. He actually kind of goes further. So basically what he did is he confused everyone else, and he made them fearful. He actually got the other candidates to this point where they were afraid that he might start ridiculing and mocking them. So better to just try to avoid him and try to avoid a direct confrontation and hope that someone else is going to take care of him and kind of, just kind of decide to launch some kind of kamikaze attack and attack him, and that they'll be able to kind of get by without making that direct attack. But, another way to think about this, and actually one way to think about this is in warfare. If you are faster than your enemy, your system of telling, kind of your tanks and your planes, kind of how to go from here to there, if you have a better communication system, you can outflank an enemy, because you can move faster, you can respond faster. Because, first you're moving fast, then you're able to get information faster to your army. You see what I'm saying? So what you've got to do is actually get inside of his head and actually start confusing him. Because everyone else is supposed to be cowed and everyone else is supposed to be afraid, and they're supposed to back down. And also, he's the only one who makes insults. He's the only one who behaves in this kind of petty way. So then when suddenly other people start addressing his vulnerabilities, when they start embarrassing him, when they start making him look silly, when they start... Now, one possibility is that perhaps he's a pretty insecure guy. Not necessarily, but it seems like, kind of people who behave in certain ways, you gotta wonder about, kind of how genuinely confident that person really is. When you're someone who surrounds yourself with, paid friends, who laugh at your jokes, etc., it kind of creates a little bit of a bubble. So, one strategy is that you actually have to get inside that bubble and you have to be faster, and you actually have to start embarrassing him and actually start taking him off balance so that he starts doing things that are embarrassing. Frankly, it might be too late to do that. And it also could be the case that there's no candidate who is capable of doing that, because that actually requires real skill. But that's one theory as to kind of how you go about doing that. And of course, the danger is that by doing that, by kind of learning from his tactics, you could also be diminishing yourself, and you can make yourself look like a clown too, right? So I mean, so it's actually a pretty high risk strategy, but it's also a high reward strategy.
We have one last question.
One more question?
Is this the
I think
last
it's on. Go ahead.
Hi.
Yeah, good.
Thank you for being here.
Oh, can we take both these questions maybe? Just to take
Oh, yeah,
both
sure.
of them?
Two more. Yeah.
So it seems to me that the rise of Donald Trump can largely be attributed to the fact that he's made illegal immigration one of his central campaign issues, an issue that resonates with a large portion of the American population. It seems like a lot of mainstream Republicans avoid the issue because the donor class and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, they don't really care about it. They benefit from cheap labor. So I guess my question to you is, do you think, given the success of Trump, from this issue, do you think more mainstream Republicans will make illegal immigration a central issue, and do you think that Republicans will advocate for an immigration policy based on education and skills, like they have in Australia, rather than our immigration policy, which is based largely on family reunification since 1965?
What's your name?
Victor.
So, Victor, you have a very sophisticated understanding of these issues. I recently gave a talk to some folks in Silicon Valley, and kind of went around the room and asking people, just how does our immigration system work? What do you think? Before we wound up having the talk, and it was incredible because people don't have a really good sense. They don't have a really good sense of the numbers. They don't really have a good sense of these dynamics. So when you think about the ideological argument about immigration, what you hear from the side of people who don't take your view is that, it's about humanitarianism. It's also about, kind of immigration is always positive for the economy. And they really try to make a generalization about immigration as one thing rather than it's a lot of different things, some of which have some effects, some of which have other effects. It's not so much a matter of good or bad as deciding which effects actually matter, right? And I think that that's, it's a really hard thing to talk about, and it's complicated. One reason I would argue is that for many people, immigration is not, one way to think about immigration is that it's just one policy issue. It's one domestic policy issue like other domestic policy issues. And one policy issue is, well, do we want free colleges? Or do we want, let's say, a different system that kind of allows colleges to become less expensive and have more companies, who knows, any number of things, right? It's an issue like that. It's treated as a different kind of issue. It's treated by many people as an issue about anti-racism. Are you a racist? Are you someone who kind of has X or Y kind of feeling about the world? Are you kind of a bad person or not? And that's kind of how it's seen, rather than, well, hey, the United States is a country where, in Japan, 1 out of 20 adults has a low level of literacy and numeracy. In the United States, it's 1 out of 7. If you look, so in a way, if you thought about immigration as, well, we want to raise the average skill level of the country, and we don't care what the race of the person is or whatever else, that's what we think about. That's a really different way to talk about it, but that's actually not the kind of conversation we tend to have about it in the United States. So the ideological argument is that it's about race and racism, it's about inclusion and all these other things. When you look at about how our immigration policy actually works, really it makes a lot of sense in political terms as people who are naturalized citizens, like my parents. They want an immigration policy that guarantees that their relatives can enter the country too. And in many cases that could mean, we have many people who actually come from middle-income countries rather than the poorest countries in the world. If you think of immigration policy as a way to help the poorest countries in the world, you would actually have immigrants coming from a very different set of countries than actually come to the United States right now. So, it's funny because the ideological justification is one thing, but the actual political result, what we really have, is really, really different. And another thing, though, where I disagree with you is that, Trump has been kind of unique in talking about illegal immigration. I would say that what Trump has done is talk about immigration to court in a way that's actually been, I think, kind of not entirely bad. Because Mitt Romney actually talked a lot about illegal immigration too, but he wanted to increase all other forms of legal immigration. So in a way, people talk about illegal immigration as a proxy for talking about immigration as a whole, when in fact the issues are pretty connected. Because if you have a large amount of less skilled immigration, whether you think that's good or bad, if it's legal or illegal, it winds up having a lot of pretty similar effects. Why is that? One reason is because 8% of births in the United States are to parents who enter the country illegally. So one of the reasons why the president put in place this executive order a little while ago called DACA was to shield the parents of US citizen children from deportation. So that's a complicated factor, right? Because if you're going to deport people, so that's why some people, myself included, are sympathetic to, well, that's why we can't have birthright citizenship. You must limit citizenship to people who are lawfully in the United States. That's a very controversial view. It's not widely shared, I realize. But, kind of when you think about how these things are all connected, so the illegal and legal issues, they're actually, kind of a little bit more complicated than people think. And when you talk about moving in an Australian or Canadian direction, I personally think that is deeply sensible. But the problem is that that's not really on the map of our political discourse. And the people who do take a view that we should have a more critical perspective about our immigration policy, it's not because immigrants are bad, but because we've got to think about, well, who is coming and what kind of country are they coming to? In 1900, the United States was a country where if you didn't have a high school education, you could find work. You would be poor, you'd be at the lower end, but you wouldn't be so desperately poor. And also, by the way, we didn't have lots of social programs designed to kind of help people. So about half of the Italians who came to the United States in the first decades of the 20th century went back home. Whereas now, that doesn't happen. Now we have a safety net that I think is in generally a pretty good thing in a lot of ways. But we have the safety net, so it actually changes the picture. The country is really different today than it had been before, which to my mind means that we have different challenges, we need a different immigration policy. Another thing is that we have so much domestic poverty, including so much immigrant poverty in the United States, that I really believe we need an immigration policy that is going to help us address those problems by attracting people who can pay taxes. And who are not necessarily going to be in need of these services that we badly need that are overstretched and overburdened. But that's a really different way to talk about it than if you're insulting Mexicans, right? And, and the problem is, in our country, the people who take a more critical perspective on immigration they're way more likely to talk about it in this way that inflames this whole discourse of it's all about race and racism. Whereas in the UK, it's kind of interesting. It's a very different case, because in Britain, all of the less skilled immigration has been European. It's really fascinating. There's been some kind of asylum immigration, but the bulk of it has been people from Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, and that's the flashpoint. So in a funny way, they're able to have a totally different conversation where you've got people who look like me saying, look, I'm no racist here, but kind of I think that having so many Bulgarian workers, kind of causes a problem for kind of working class folks who just want to make a living here. They can say that there. And they're taken seriously, saying that here in the United States, it's a very, very different picture, because those same dynamics are at play, but everyone wants to make it about race and racism, and particularly the people who benefit, in some cases, from the kind of status quo conversation about immigration policy. So, there are lots of worthwhile views on this question. I'm not saying that I have the kind of right answer, but I think that's one way to think about it. Thank you very much. So I'm going to have to be, I've been so long-winded, you guys. Thanks for bearing with me. I really appreciate it.
Hello. I have two sort of interrelated things, and then respond.
Okay, because these guys are desperate to leave the room.
In 1986, we got the Simpson-Mazzoli amnesty, which amnesty 1.5 million people.
A little bit more than that, but yeah, go ahead.
More than that. I don't know how much more of an outreach to the Hispanic population that could have been. In the Bush election that happened after that, Hispanics voted something like 75-25 against Bush. In 2006, Ken Melvin, head of the RNC, went running around doing apologetics before the NAACP. John McCain had all these, outreach groups, toward black voters and things like that. John McCain lost in Louisiana. He got less of the black vote as a proportion of his, voter profile than David Duke did when he ran back in the 90s. So isn't this idea that we're going to turn the Republican Party into this sort of non-white, multiracial party kind of...
And there's a second one you want to do?
Yeah.
We'll address it, but yeah.
Well, there's that, and then there's with regard to immigration. Conservatives, from what I see from the establishment, conservatives have this attitude, which is that the demographic shifts associated with immigration and the political implications of it are natural, and everything comes from that, as if we can't touch it, when in fact, what's happened since 1965 is totally artificial. The Third World Invasion of America is an artificial process. And Jacob Javits, you mentioned it, he sent a letter to the AJC saying that we have opened the floodgates to Third World immigration. Third World immigration, just like many other things, has a political narrative, and it is totally in favor of the political left. So I have no idea why. And I know the official position of the National Review on these issues. I don't know why.
Well, it's interesting. I'm not sure you do, because National Review has taken a position that kind of favors limiting immigration since the early 90s pretty consistently. But we do take a somewhat different view from you. So is that, so I'm happy to answer your question now, sort of, we're kind of addressing those themes. So when you're talking about the Third World invasion, a really important thing to keep in mind is that actually, the Third World is pretty big, right? Sort of, you've got sort of countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, et cetera. It's pretty big and diverse. And so when you're looking at people from different countries, you get pretty different results, kind of both politically and economically in terms of who you're talking about. So earlier on, I talked about that kind of inequality-equality difference. And so, about how more equal countries send some kinds of immigrants and less equal countries send other kinds of immigrants. One way to think about it is that if I'm in a highly unequal country and I'm at the top of the heap in that country, kind of, it doesn't actually make a lot of sense for me to leave. Whereas if we're talking about more equal countries, it's a kind of a different story. So, and it's also not purely by country. It's kind of about what are the qualities, what are the kind of skills that you had, et cetera. And this is true first world versus third world, where, you have entry wages. What is the first amount of money you kind of made when you came to the United States when you first got a job? And there's some immigrants, kind of from some countries, where, they're earning 90% more than the U.S. average when they first arrive. And, somewhere they're earning, as much, 50, 60% less or more. And kind of that is actually it's kind of all over the map. So I think that I get your point. The 65 law, no one anticipated the scale of the migration that came. That is absolutely true. But
I think some did. I think the John Birchers did. Your magazine kind of tried to vary.
Yeah, I would like to see kind of. So it's certainly good in Britain. A guy like Ina Powell, there are kind of a few people who kind of made correct projections. And there's certainly some people who kind of were. fearful about it. But my understanding, and and I would love to talk to you more about this, is that kind of in terms of the actual scale and also how the way the chain worked, et cetera. But you also have so there's a lot of heterogeneity in that group, and I think that that's pretty important to keep in mind. In terms of the political effect, it really is true that if you look at naturalized immigrants, it's really based around class. So if you're looking at people who have low incomes, people who are immigrants or second generation, they're going to tend to vote for redistribution. When you look at people who have somewhat higher incomes, that's going to vary depending on a variety of other cultural factors. But I would agree that the policies that we have in place right now are actually problematic for the Republican political future for some of the reasons.
I mean, it's pretty much the end of it. They vote 8-2 for Democrats, the current cross-section of immigration.
I also think that if you had a policy like what you see in Australia or Canada, for example, where you have a very different result for people who are coming, in many cases, from the developing world, but also those are voters who are actually back into the right of center political party. So I do think that it's not intrinsic that immigration will have this effect, but I do think that the political policies we pursue in the United States have had a political effect that has been definitely negative for people who advocate center-right free market policy.
You know what? I think I'm going to hold it here, and
Happy
been
to
very
talk to you about
patient,
this. Yeah.
and thank you for sticking with us. And please join me one more time in thanking you. Thank you.